I mentioned in my last two travel videos about my fascination of the jungle across the street. This was when we lived in the country of Panama for 2 years before I began school. The jungle opened my eyes to all consideration as to what was beyond. While there, we drove to the end of the Pan American Highway. I was able to look south into the Darien Gap, and just beyond was South America. I knew that, too, was a different world, and it piqued my curiosity. What was this South America, I wondered? I continue in this episode to look at my developing question of this through the eyes of my elementary school years. When we returned to the United States, I was 4.5 years old. I noticed there were wooded places that I thought were jungles, like in Panama. They were places of tall trees and thick underbrush. Jungle is what I called them until the neighborhood kids strongly corrected me, and from then on, it was the woods. I was fascinated with them even before my first expedition, but it wasn't the jungle. I spent every moment I could in the woods, but it didn't have the allure of the jungle. It was interesting, but wasn't a place of endless possibilities. The woods always seemed to be limited in size. I wouldn't discover large forest until a couple of years later. My jungle was non-ending as far as I knew. There was some prohibitiveness to the woods, but before my 5th year, I no longer thought of it in that way. I missed my jungle. Shortly after moving back to the United States, our family went to a drive-in movie theater, a huge treat for me. I liked most public things as a kid, and the merry-go-round and other pre-film delights added to it. We went and watched A True Story, a film about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which won the Academy Award Best Picture for that year. I greatly enjoyed both Paul Newman and Robert Redford's characters, who were American outlaws in the late 1800s. Their charisma as wanderers, bank robbers, and in an adventure captivated my young mind and would be my favorite film for years. I would grow to love Western films, as the characters were independent and travelers. The only expectations there were in what they had of themselves. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, then, on the run from authorities, headed for South America and the country of Bolivia. My mind quickly took me back to looking into the Darien Gap, just short of South America. I knew Bolivia was one of the countries on the other side. I thought to myself, they did it. They went where I want to go. This was the first adult film that I enjoyed. In 3rd grade, I read a story about a 17-year-old girl named Julianne, born in Peru, to German professors. She and her family would be sent to the jungle in Paraguay, and there her parents taught her tropical survival skills. Later, while in high school, and a year before I read the story, she was on a plane that was struck by lightning, and the plane disintegrated over the Peruvian jungle. She then fell some 3 kilometers, or a couple of miles, still in her seat, which had been separated from the plane, and she, in a miracle, survived. The fall broke her collarbone and caused some open wounds. She knew to follow the streams, as it would bring her to bigger and bigger streams. Bigger streams or rivers are where people would be found who could rescue her. Her open wounds became filled with maggots, and she had countless numbers of leeches attached to her. Her survival skills took over Despite having to crawl through the water, she made it to a river. There, lumberjacks found her, 11 days after the crash. She poured gasoline on her wounds to remove the maggots, leeches, and other parasites. More than a dozen passengers were found to have survived the crash, but all died in the jungle except Julianne. 2 days after being discovered, she was evacuated by air. Since I have read this story in 3rd grade, I have envied her. I wanted to have that experience. I wanted that story, that survival. Later that same year, I read another survival story in South America. This was about a plane crash high in the Andes Mountains between Chile and Argentina. The plane was carrying a Uruguay rugby team and others, 45 in total. This happened about 10 months after Julianne's survival. A dozen were killed immediately, and several more in the coming days, from injuries and the frigid cold. For 72 days the survivors endured in the harsh climate. An avalanche killed 13 more, and the survivors resorted to cannibalism. 2 of the survivors would then leave in late spring to find their way out. They hiked and climbed for 10 days before communicating with some farmers across a river. One of the farmers rode his horse 10 hours to get help. The next day, the 2 were rescued, and then the others were as well. I later spent time in the general area of the crash. This survival story also occupied my mind for years to come, as I wished for the experience of surviving as the 2 had for 72 days around the plane, then the hike climb out of 10 days. Although, of course, not the cannibalism. A short time after reading the 2 survival stories, I became aware of Daniel Defoe's fictional work of Robinson Crusoe. I then read this, or probably a version written for someone in elementary school. The story was said to be off the northwest coast of Venezuela, written in 1719, maybe Tobago. It is thought to have been based on a Scottish explorer on an island off the coast of central Chile, a place now named Robinson Crusoe Island. Both Robinson and the Scottish man survived shipwrecks. Robinson was stranded 28 years and the Scot for 4 years. As a young child, I watched the Disney film Swiss Family Robinson, a story based on Robinson Crusoe, a family marooned off the northwest coast. Both the Robinson tales were not far from the Darien Gap, the place my mind would often come back to, reminding me just beyond was South America. These tales I also imagined myself taking part. I then started viewing South America as a place you go to survive. I thought, if these people can survive, I can survive it. Please like and subscribe to the channel as YouTube decides if it will send a video on to others based on this. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.